the Napoleonic Wars are, I believe, the largest wars in human history until World War One.
Dr. Blaufarb, there's a certain fascination with Napoleon and his battle genius that came much later in his career. And many people today, including those who know very little about Napoleon, sort of hold this romantic notion about the Napoleonic Wars. Um, we think of them as sort of chivalrous, and they predate the industrial wars that came on later in the 19th century, such as the Franco-Prussian War or the U.S. Civil War. So my question is this: how unprecedented were the Napoleonic Wars?
Well, they were actually, let's just say, precedented. They were fought with exactly the same technology and tactics as previous wars in the 18th century had been fought.
Mm, okay.
There's no technological innovation whatsoever. The standard weapon that soldiers are using is a smoothbore musket, and that
Oh,
and that that particular weapon being relatively inaccurate and having relatively short range dictated a certain form of tactics, uh, linear tactics, essentially to get the most out of that kind of weapon. Armies would form themselves up in long linear formations and essentially blaze away at each other at relatively short range with these wildly inaccurate weapons. But if you line up thousands of people all shooting in the same direction with these weapons, they're pretty formidable. So
you ought to hit something.
yeah, exactly.
So
And
rifles weren't invented then yet?
rifles had been invented actually a long time earlier, but they
Uh-huh.
were hunting weapons. The reason that rifles are not used on the battlefield is because they're expensive to make. They're a kind of more precision
Yeah.
weapon. They're more expensive to make, and they also take an ungodly amount of time to reload. So
Oh,
a rifleman cannot get off a lot of shots. I don't know, maybe one shot every minute or two, whereas a musketeer can shoot 3 or 4 shots a minute.
I see. And with that number of people at that, soldiers each side, you have a huge volley.
Exactly. So you think of the way I like to describe it to my class is to my students is that essentially the combination of the smoothbore musket and the linear formations, it turns it turns battalions and regiments into collective human machine guns.
Wow. Um, okay, so technologically, it was precedented. Was the scale of the warfare unprecedented?
That's what's unprecedented.
There you go.
The number of soldiers involved in these wars was was far more than Europe and possibly anywhere in the world up to that point had ever seen. These are probably the Napoleonic Wars are, I believe, the largest wars in human history until World War One. They dwarf the
Oh,
Civil
wow.
War. Yes, yes, they are enormous. And but to be fair to the French Revolution, not to give Napoleon credit for things he didn't invent, it's actually the French Revolution that pioneers this new kind of mass army.
How so?
In 1793, at the height of the revolution, at the height of revolutionary radicalism and instability, France is being invaded from all sides by pretty much every country in Europe. And its very survival, the revolution's very survival is at stake. The revolutionary government responds by decreeing a levy en masse. It is essentially mobilizing every single male subject between the ages of 25 and 40 for potential service in the army. On paper, the levy en masse produces an army of 1.2 million soldiers. In reality, it's more like 750,000 who actually turn up. But
That's
that
still a lot.
it is a lot, especially when you consider that the largest army Europe had seen before that date had been the armies of Louis XIV,
Hmm.
nearly 100 years earlier. And Louis XIV had only managed to mobilize about 400,000 soldiers. So we're talking the French Revolution doubles or triples the previous record as far
Wow.
as army size. And Napoleon just continues this tradition.
So if we're talking about these huge numbers, then, and I don't want to get into statistics or anything, the scale of death and destruction must have also been to some extent unprecedented.
Yeah, I think it probably was. And interestingly, I think it's the numbers that lead to that kind of encourage a greater level of death and destruction. The reason is this: when Napoleon comes to power, France is putting in place, has just begun to put in place a permanent system of conscription, so that every year the government can call up tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of young men to fill the ranks, the depleted ranks of its armies.
Mhm.
For a general and statesman like Napoleon, who realizes, wow, every year I can get like say 200,000 more soldiers if I need him. It encourages him to be less than economical with the lives of his soldiers
Yeah.
on the battlefield, because he knows they can all be replaced. And in fact, after his early brilliant victories, culminating in the 1805, 1806 Austerlitz campaign and the campaign against Prussia, Napoleon increasingly relies on direct frontal assaults by essentially human wave assaults by vast conscript armies of cannon fodder that he simply throws at the enemy again and again and again, replacing them year after year after year with conscription. But his battlefield finesse is kind of diminishes as he turns more and more to like mass tactics that ultimately rest on the cheapness and the easy availability of human life.
That's so tragic.
Yeah.
Wow. He goes from military brilliance to sort of brute force. Um, in the first segment, we were talking about his roots, his back to Corsica. I'm not drawing a parallel to Hitler or anything like that. I'm just fascinated by the fact that how Hitler was also not German, yet he led Germans into war. Is that something that you've ever thought about?
About Napoleon, well, I think that by the time he's actually leading armies,
Uh-huh.
he's French now. He has become French.
Uh-huh.
One of the, whether willingly or not is a question, but the fact is that in 1793, Napoleon and his entire family are forced to flee Corsica. They
Oh,
have to,
flee.
they're driven out of the island. They're actually being threatened with violence by rival Corsican factions that oppose the French Revolution and generally oppose France. Well, the Bonaparte family, as I had mentioned earlier in our interview, had gotten in bed with the French regime right
Yeah.
after the conquest, and then got connected to the French Revolution. And so in Corsica itself, the Bonapartes are seen as traitors. They are
Oh,
seen as traitors,
wow.
and they have to flee.
Interesting.
The entire family flees. And basically, Napoleon doesn't come back to Corsica in his lifetime.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Blaufarb as we get into the perspective.